Hi, my name's Andy Williamson and I manage the carbon farming plot for the Resource Conservation District, and my role is basically to prepare the site and plant the crops, do all the harvesting and take the measurements of crop yield. So we were experimenting with 3 different practices on the carbon farming plot. The first was compost applications, and we would just mix in a small amount of compost with each bed during the preparation process. The second was mulching, and we used a woodchip mulch that we would apply to the beds after transplanting our seedlings. And the third was 2 different kinds of cover crop. So we had a legume-based cover crop and a grass-based cover crop, and those would be planted in the winter during the wet season in anticipation of the summer crops. And so we would till those cover crops in after about 3 or 4 months of growing, and then prepare the beds before planting the summer crops. So with each experiment we had control and treatment beds. So we divided each quadrant of the plot into 2, with 7 treatment beds and 7 control beds, and we did see a increase in crop yield with every treatment option. In terms of the sort of cost benefit as a farmer of using each one, I would say that the compost application was the easiest to apply. You can just add the compost with your fertilizers and any other treatments that you would add to your beds before preparation, and it doesn't really take any extra time, and it gave a decent increase in yield. I would say that the woodchip mulch was the most difficult experimental practice to incorporate, because it took a long time to apply the mulch by hand between the seedlings, and then a long time to remove the mulch at the end of the harvest before preparing the beds again, because the mulch would bury in the soil, and we didn't want all of that additional carbon to be mixed into the soil while we were preparing the beds for the next crop. The cover crop, both types of cover crop had good results. They were fairly easy and not too expensive to incorporate into the model, but you would need some kind of machinery to do it. Doing it by hand would be very difficult, so you would need at a minimum a mower and a tiller to incorporate those cover crops the way that we did into our growing system. And the other difficult aspect about cover crops, if you're a row crop producer, is that you have to take your beds out of production for a significant amount of time. And here in San Diego, with the climate that we have, when you can grow commercial crops all year round, if you're growing fruits and vegetables, it makes less sense to take the beds out of production for 3 or 4 months while you're letting the cover crop grow. So it does have an economic impact in that respect. An alternative might be to just use a rotation with regular plantings of legumes in between any other crop, where you can then mix the residue of that crop into the preparation of the next bed. So you don't actually have to plant a cover crop, but you still have some nitrogen fixing plants in your rotation. So another aspect of the cover crop management to consider is how you're going to sow the seeds, and we just broadcast them because we have a very small plot, and then we rake them a little bit just to incorporate them with the soil. And we also had to irrigate for a few weeks to establish the plants, even though we were planting in the winter, before we could let the rain take over. And that might not be the case every season, but in dry winters you may also have to consider irrigation. So in terms of what I've learned from this experience, if I was a new farmer coming to these practices now, I think what I would say is some of the practices can be a a little tricky to implement. There is the mulching and the cover cropping, there might be a steeper learning curve, and you would possibly need some specialist equipment to implement those practices on a larger scale. But composting, really, I think every farmer should be doing, because it's simple, it's cheap, there's very little extra that you have to learn, and you can just add the compost with other applications that you're putting on the field before you're preparing beds. So it is simple and easy, and it has immediate benefits in terms of yield and crop resilience.